It was summer, just a few years ago. I sleep in a bunk bed with my brothers in the room that we share. I woke up one night from the top bunk. Like I said, it was summer and it tends to get pretty stuffy at night, so the window was open. I could hear a very slow, raspy breathing and the sound of the screen from the window being scratched. I quietly rolled over onto my stomach and looked over the side of the bed, down at the window. It looked like a man, but its features were just wrong. It was as pale as the moon and bone thin. It had long arms, and it had a hand with long fingers scratching at the screen of the window. Its eyes gave off a soft glow that sort of lit up the room a little bit. It was looking around the room from behind the window. It wasn't even trying to get in, it was just examining the room. From what I could tell, it hadn't spotted me yet, and I couldn't get out of the bed without it seeing me. So I just crawled over to the other side of the bed and laid silently, terrified, until morning. It had left after about an hour, judging by the digital clock on top of the TV. The next morning I went outside and studied the window. Whatever had been there had to have been at least 7 feet tall, because the window was about 5 feet off the ground, and this thing was hunched over. A few weeks go by, and I go on a camping trip. My brothers were in the Boy Scouts, and I was allowed to go on the camping trips, which I love because I've always loved the forest. It was in this enormous forest, in the middle of nowhere. The property belongs to someone from Scouts, and there's nobody else for miles. Everything goes fine. Fun days of fishing and hiking and s'mores. Everyone's about to get in their tents, and everyone's silenced by an echoing, blood-curdling scream. It was absolutely not a fox. And there haven't been any mountain lions in the entire state for centuries. So it couldn't have been one of those either. Somehow, everyone was able to get some sleep after that. I convinced myself to get into the big family tent, and soon, I'm out cold. I woke up to the sound of the tent fabric being scratched at. I look around, and on one of the walls, long scratches are being made periodically from the outside. I turn on the lantern hanging from the ceiling and it stops. I can see its silhouette. It's the same thing from only weeks before. Large, bone thin, with long arms and legs. It creeps away and begins to do the same thing to other tents at the campsite. I wait for it to finally leave, and I turn off the lantern, and somehow I was able to fall asleep. My dad's into paranormal stuff, but I don't know how he'd take all this. I haven't told it much, and every person who cared to listen didn't take it seriously. I haven't seen it since, but whatever it was had followed me from my house in the suburbs to the forest, out of town. I've always slept on the other side of the bed since then, away from the window. After some research into it, I think this might have been a skinwalker. My family moved to Pennsylvania when I was 4. I was immediately entranced with living in the country, with several acres of woods behind us, and the house seemed huge to me at the time. However, as a kid, I was always sensitive to spirits and energies, and there was definitely something creepy going on in this house. My parents noticed that I stayed with our dog Bambi a lot. He was a small sheepdog and my adventure buddy. When we went walking in the woods, in case you're questioning my parents, they trusted me, as young as age 7, to walk around alone as long as I was with my dog, as he was very protective of me, and my dad would give me his cell phone to carry with me in case I needed any help. Up until I was about 15, I spent a lot of time alone by choice. After school, I'd be home by 3:20. I'd eat lunch and immediately take Bambi out into the woods, and we'd explore the surrounding forests and fields and meadows and ponds together. He was always right by my side, and he seemed really attuned to spiritual stuff too. And if I felt something was in the house, he'd bark at it or whine, or I'd watch him follow it around. Usually he'd pick up on the presence of something at the same time that I would. Anyway, from my backyard to the left, there is a small strip of trees, and in the fall and winter, when the branches are bare, you can see the field next door, which is about 300 yards from the house itself. There is a big plane shed up there and a kind of runway where my neighbor would fly his biplanes off. What's kind of important to the story is that I have no neighbors for a mile in any direction. It was pretty rare to see any kind of people on the surrounding properties, unless it was my neighbor haying the fields in the summer. But one day, in early fall, I had begun tromping through the woods with Bambi for several hours. I let him run off leash most of the time, but he would only run ahead about 20 feet and keep turning around to check that I was still there. If I lost sight of him, he'd retrace his steps and find me again. That day I got caught up in whittling something, so Bambi ran off a little bit, and I suddenly realized I was alone. Then suddenly, there was a lot of crashing deeper in the woods, and I heard Bambi's alarm bark and a lot of yelping, and then some screeching. Raccoons and gophers make really fucking scary distress sounds, so I figured that was it. So I called Bambi, and he popped out of some bush, covered in pickers, and since I was spooked, I ran right back home with him. Right as I got to the back door, I stopped to catch my breath, and Bambi and I were just standing there when I spotted someone or something standing on the very edge of the runway. It ran along the higher end of the field, and then there was a steep drop off the edge of the hill at the very end of it. It didn't appear to be wearing anything distinctive, but even in the dusk, I could see that they appeared completely black, or everything about them was very shadowy and dark. This is the part that gives me shivers now. They were standing, facing off the runway, and then I saw them hunch over, then slowly raise their head and yell, "Bambi," in the same high voice I would use to call him. It had the same vocal inflection as me too, but it sounded like they were trying really hard to sound like me. Next to me, Bambi tucked his tail under, lowered his head, and growled softly. It called again, but this time it sounded like they were losing their voice, as if they had been calling for a while. In my 8-year-old logic, I assumed that someone was trying to steal my dog. But why would they stand in the middle of the field and be obvious about it? And when I told my parents about it that night, they dismissed my story. The next day, I went to my cousin's house 2 miles up the road, and my uncle told me about an animal he saw the night before that he was trying to identify. He said it looked like an emaciated cow sprinting across the bridge over the creek, which is about 300 yards from the runway. Also, since then, anyone who's been at my house has always been uneasy around the creek and the plane shed, whether or not they're interested at all in the paranormal. I know that a lot of death happens in nature, but I've also found several goats ripped up in the field. The nearest house with any amount of goats or farm is nearly 4 miles away, and a lot of unexplained things have happened up there. My husband and I are avid campers. We live in Southern California and go out to the mountains as often as possible with our 2 dogs. I'm from Oregon and grew up in the woods. I did search and rescue religiously and spent much of my time going on trail rides and hikes as much as possible. Just to give you an idea on how much experience we have, we've been married for 2 years and I've already been on over 20 camping trips trying to visit as many different spots as possible. Sometimes even switching campsites for a weekend, only spending one night. But this last trip scared the camper out of me, and it may be a while until I'm ready to return to the woods. We stopped by a favorite of ours called Holcomb Valley Campground. We set up camp, played with the dogs, and went for a small walk on the many back roads and some of the short trails, just revisiting our favorite areas. The dogs acted normal, running around off leash and playing. We were comfortable and calm, and came back to dinner and hot chocolate before it got too cold. Then we slipped into our tent for the night. Me being pregnant, I have to go to the bathroom often during the night. I got up around 2 a.m., grabbed my flashlight, and brought one of our dogs, a golden retriever, with me. Now, don't let the reputation of the golden retriever fool you about mine. He was raised without much contact with other people, except for family and our other dog, a pit bull mutt. Moose, our golden retriever, is very alert, doesn't like other people, and growls to warn them off. And especially after we became pregnant, he is overprotective of me. Both our dogs are fit and used to go camping, and going off leash, they don't leave our sides. So Moose and I made our way to the bathrooms, and of course, he came in with me. While I was doing my business, Moose's ears pricked straight up and he growled his "get away" growl. I was nervous. I didn't bring my knife like an idiot. All I had was a flashlight. Figuring it was just someone needing to use the bathroom, I ordered Moose to stay by my side and we left, but no one was there. Moose's hackles were up so high, he looked huge, and he was pressed up against my legs so tightly, it made me almost have to pee again. But we fast walked all the way back to our tent and jumped in. I made sure my knife was there, my husband was okay, and that our pit bull was okay too. Everything was fine, and Moose relaxed a bit, laying down right next to my head. I eventually fell asleep. Now, here's where it gets really disturbing. I woke up about 45 minutes later to a low woof from Moose and our pit bull growling. They were listening intently to the side of the tent, both of them almost shaking. I put a hand on them to calm them down, and that only made them jump and growl even more. My husband is such a heavy sleeper, I knew I couldn't wake him, so I got a knife ready, and I listened. I would say it was about 40 or 45 feet away from us, something stalking over the fence that divided the campsite from the road. It sounded like deer with light feet just barely crunching over the ground. I had been camping with herds of deer before, and it sounded very much like that, and our dogs had never seen a deer before, so it made sense for them to be scared. I laid back down and just quieted them, saying very clearly, "Shh, it's okay guys, just a deer." And then, the deer outside said something in almost my same voice. "Just the deer." This voice said it like it was practicing something. Like how you rehearse a line you just can't get right in a speech. I gasped so hard, my dog started shaking like crazy. My husband jumped up and hollered at them for scaring him. I listened, almost in tears, for the thing, but no sound came. The dogs were on edge for what seemed like hours until they finally calmed down, and it wasn't until then that I was able to fall asleep too. When I awoke the next morning, it was from a bad dream. I just remembered running barefoot and my feet were cold from being outside of the sleeping bag. It was near 5 a.m. and the dogs were on edge again. This time I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my knife and sat up, listening to everything. I said clearly, "Are you there?" towards the direction of the fence, but nothing said anything. I think I repeated myself about 2 more times until a coyote howled. It was far away and clear. I was starting to calm down, thinking it was silly for thinking that something like a skinwalker was out there, when the coyote howled again, this time much, much closer to us, like right across the road close. And this one was not a coyote. It was high-pitched, then would end in a hoarse growl type voice. It did it again and again, rehearsing the howl over and over. My husband woke up this time asking me if it was a coyote. Petrified, I told him, I don't think so. This thing howled for over 10 minutes until it stopped and finally left. My dogs were just as scared as I was. That morning, we went for another walk, then packed our things to move to the next campsite. Moose ended up vomiting most of the day, and that kind of made me panic. He was so on edge. He couldn't keep anything down, and our pit bull was listening to anything and everything, never leaving our sides. That night, we were at a completely different campsite on the other side, so nothing happened, and the dogs were finally able to get some sleep. The next day, we stopped in Big Bear for lunch. Moose was all better at that time, and we all went for a walk in the village when we ran into our neighbors. We recognized at Holcomb Valley Campground. We asked them about the coyote, and they suddenly went pale. They told us about what happened that night. We'll call the woman Mary and the man Ben. They had a small dog named Benji. They said Benji had to go out in the middle of the night, so they unzipped the tent and let him do his business. He just ran to the fence and was barking until Ben went out and got him. Ben said that across the road he saw a man standing there. And when he waved a hand, the man ran away into the woods. All night, Benji and the other dogs were barking like crazy until a few hunters went to investigate. They had their bows and a couple of knives and a few trained hunting dogs with them. They crossed the road and went after the man to see if he needed help. They got about 20 feet on the side when the man screamed at them with something between coyote and those dinosaurs from Jurassic Park, quoting Ben. It woke everyone up, and one guy claimed the thing shifted before them into something like a deer with impossibly thin legs and bounded away faster than any animal possibly could. My husband doesn't believe in that kind of stuff, so he shrugged it off as people being tired and the night being so dark. But I know that it was a skinwalker, and that's enough to keep me away. So, for people who love to go camp up in Big Bear, be careful when you venture up into those hills, because there's something up there. Hey everybody, thanks for listening. I really like doing these Skinwalker stories. They're pretty interesting to me, definitely one of my favorite creatures or monsters, if you will. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. I'll be back really soon with another one. Until then, I'll see you at the witching hour.